at the end of the last demo, we went back to our spot illustration and we took our digital color, which is millions of colors, right? And I ran it through an action that separated it into just 3 colors with black ink in dot separations that are very exaggerated dots, just so you can see them clearly. And when you layer them all together, they look like this. And this is what this character would look like in an old newspaper print, at only around 25 dots per inch. What's fun about that is now I can take this information, select all these layers, for instance, let's swoop that out, and I can put it onto my spot illustration. In fact, instead of going to the PNG, instead of saving any of these, I'm going to open up the original Assignment 7 PSD file, which had the line work and had all the coloring, and I'm going to add it into that. So here's my link coloring test. Now I'm going to take the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black layers here, drag and drop them onto here. And my action is set for professional standard, which is 300, whereas my project is at 350. So I'm going to have to grow it a little bit, but I like that because then I have to place it by hand, and that allows for a little bit of extra offsetting. Okay, so now we have all 4 of those dot layers on top of my computer color, right? And it's a little offset. You can see that. They're still selected, so I can use the arrow keys and nudge them into place if I want it exactly. Okay, and now I can actually move all of them underneath my black lines if I want, because that's how the printing would usually happen. The black lines would be filled. And then I can arrange it just right. So there you go. So what's the advantage of that? Well, this is without. Now this gives me the option of adding in, to kind of break up the digitalness of it, adding in layer by layer some of these retro effects. And I can play with the opacity of them, layer by layer. I like what that magenta layer does. The yellow is maybe a little too yellow, so let me take the opacity down on that. And then the black, let me take the opacity down on that. So it's just a little more subtle. And I like that better than without it. Okay, so let's look at how this actually works. What is offsetting? So I'm going to save that, and while that's in the background, I'll show you some of these slides I've put together. So offset printing. Because we can't print with light like we see computer images with red, green, and blue dots, we have to print with limited inks. And those limited inks are printed in dot patterns that are what are called a halftone pattern, like bricks in a wall. And they're all each printed at a different angle. So you'll see the angle of the cyan looks like it's going like this. The angle of the magenta looks like it's going like that. The angle of the yellow is actually going straight up and down. And then blacks will always traditionally be at 45-degree angles. And they are set that way so that when you see them all together, and this is one of my sticker designs, and this is made to be 3D, when you put them all together, ooh, 3D steak with the glasses. Not that 3D steak is all that hard, but when you put them all together, it gives you the illusion of other colors. And you can see these little circles, those are called Gaussian roses. And that's where all the different angles of the dots overlap each other. So here's another design. And you can see I intentionally offset it here. So I misregistered the red with the yellow. So I got that little yellow highlight and then the black on the edge there. And it just makes it look very vintage. So here's another design. That's what the dots are doing up close. And again, this is just with yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. Now what I'll often do is I'll combine that with my digital color. So this is digital kind of vector line work and digital flat color, then with subtle dots laid as a texture over the top to get this illustration. And it just makes what would otherwise be a very digitized illustration look a lot more engaging. Now all of this is inspired by old printing methods, like this old comic book, which in the first place was printed on not white paper. It was printed on kind of cream-colored newsprint. So the whitest white you could get was about like this. And then for skin tones, you had very few options. So you basically did that formula of skin tone, or you could do a more yellow version of skin tone, which they chose strangely in this illustration to make them look like they're more in the background, except that his head is a little bit more colored so that we know she's crying about him being with another girl. Ah, romance. But you'll see the very limited color here. But what attracts me to this isn't the limited color, it's how the flat colors of the sky and even of the skin are broken up into kind of these cloudy formations of dots. And that just has to do with the low quality of the printing. So I like to imitate that. So here you see very clean vector outlines on one of my designs, but then the dots that give you the color are intentionally offset so they muddy it a little bit to look a little bit more hand done. Because these dot screens are registered in a mechanical process on lithograph presses, and sometimes, especially on newspapers, which run so fast through the presses, they misalign. And so I get a design like that. What are other ways you can use separating color channels? Well, you can get conceptual effects like this, just separating out the cyan channel, even though these aren't dot separated. These are just separating out the cyan and the red channel so they work with 3D lenses that selectively filter out those channels. Here's one I think is a really good example. This uses dot separation, but it just uses two inks on a cream-colored paper. So it uses the magenta ink for the skin of the horse, and it uses the blue ink for the skull of the horse. And so you can see both at once. They separate really well, and where they overlap, you get the most dimension. Again, this is what they use in old comics. Now the only difference is with old comics, the black lines would be full bleed. So you would have black dots sometimes, but most of the time you would have black line work that's either solid or hatched in, but the colors would always be separated into dots. So here are some other contemporary artists that use it, this dot separation effect, either to get vintage effects or just to play with the idea of transparency and overlap to make things look older. You can find a lot of tutorials about how to make things look old and retro that have to do with halftone filters. And there is a halftone filter in Photoshop, but it's not nearly as controllable as what I'm going to show you. So it has to do with how our eye sees value, right? This is one of those tutorials that you can find just using halftone filters. But let's really understand what halftones are. So when things are printed, they can only be printed with a limited number of inks. And the way those inks are sprayed in different dots and how they overlap with other inks gives us the illusion of full spectrum color. And it's incredibly effective. So even though this is very low resolution, from a distance you can tell exactly what three-dimensional structure that is. Here is just an example from a publication in a book. And this is how all color images are printed. This looks very dimensional, but if you zoom in on it, that's how this color is made, through these different angles of dot separations. And when you add them all together, they make these little circles. These are called Gaussian roses, but that's what gives you the potential for full spectrum color. It's called optical mixing. And there's more than one type of dot you can use. You can use lots of different dots. You can use white dots on solid ink. You can use thinner dots, thicker dots. You can use sand pattern dots that aren't done in this mechanical halftone print. But the most traditional just uses cyan, magenta, and yellow as the colors, the primary ink colors, and then you add black to that to get lights and darks. And you separate them in a halftone pattern at these different angles. 45 degrees for black, 0 degrees for yellow. There's different ways you can write this. Negative 15 degrees for cyan, and 15 degrees positive for magenta. So you notice that the magenta, yellow, and cyan are only 15 degrees different from each other. So 15 degrees positive, 0, 15 degrees negative, but then the black is a full 30 degrees separate from the closest, which is magenta. So black is always 45 degrees. And that gives you these really nice, clear Gaussian roses. This is a contemporary artist, digital artist, who did all of the Indiana Jones movie as a comic strip in old style using halftone separations. Very effective. And this is how they did it, right? So it's the same thing. Black is always at 45. Magenta here is at positive 15, but another way you can see that is at 75. So again, it's 30. It can be 30 above black or 30 below black. Here, cyan is at 15, which can also be said as 105, and yellow is at 0, which could also be said to be 90. And this is a close-up of one of those pieces. Now, this is what I like about old printing. The black ink is done as a solid line, right? But then when you print the colored dots on top of the black ink, you get what's called 100% black. And that black will be shinier and darker than just the black line alone. And remember, this is the difference between pixels per inch on a computer screen and dots per inch through a printing mechanism. So here's Jessica Elba separated into color dots, a low dots per inch, but a high resolution, so that each dot is circular and not square. So on and on we go. Here's the image. You can see the black, the cyan, the magenta, the yellow, all together they make this up. Even grays, when they're printed, are usually printed in color. And you can get gray just by having mostly black dots and then very, very small dots for the other colors to get chromatic grays, colorful grays. In Japanese comics, because they are so they are produced with such rapidity, they are done so quickly and published so quickly, that the inking artist actually just use halftone dot stickers and screens while they're inking. So this is a sticker that's cut out and adapted so that it will immediately print correctly with black ink. So it doesn't have to be a digital separation process at all. It's just black ink and sticker dots, or rub-on dots, which were popular when I was in illustration school. But by understanding it, you can do some really cool effects with offsets. So I want you to understand it. So how do we do it? And this is all kind of contemporary art that uses it. Well, what you have to do is you first have to separate your image into channels. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my PNG image. Which is just a flattened image that's cut out, right? And the first thing you have to do to separate out colors manually, which is kind of a challenge, which is why I give you an action for it, is next to layers you'll see channels. And then you are going to turn off all the channels except for one. So in this case, I will just look at, let's say, the red channel. And when you just look at one channel, it will show as black and white, because that's how the computer sees it. It's either black or white.